Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the information in this presentation is not to be or construed as investment advice. The information presented are subject to change without notice, and while we have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the content is reliable and accurate, we have not independently verified the content and are not responsible for errors therein. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap with me, Richard Diaz. Every week, we'll be exploring macroeconomic and market-related themes and how they affect Canada and Canadians. This week, episode 2, Canada's immigration own goal. This week's episode is broken up into 4 parts, from pride to penury, the impact on housing and rents, labor market woes, and of course, as always, why do we as investors care? So let's kick it off with the first section, how Canada's immigration went from the envy of the world to penury, or the disaster that it's become. So I think it's important to sort of figure out or reassess and revisit where we've come from. So in 2015, if you use the Google machine, you'll see there's many articles from academics, journals, and politicians alike talking about how Canada's immigration system was the envy of the world. And that's the word that's used over and over again. It was rather strict, but ample and open. And it was based on immigration, as on a point system based on educational attainment, language, skills shortages, and labor market needs of Canada at the time. And you'll see in the next slide that it was quite generous in the sense that lots and lots of people immigrated to Canada at the time. You could see where we are right now, which is, the articles are growing and there's, increasing political pressure for the current government to change its ways and to reverse some of the damage, let's say, that's been done over the last few years. In fact, today, the day of recording, I think they've just announced something to do with temporary foreign workers after an incredible amount of pressure and overwhelming evidence that immigration system is no longer fit for purpose. But how we got there is important to assess too. After the campaign of 2015, the government, made changes to this Canadian Citizenship Act to make it easier to obtain Canadian citizenship. They increased targets, and in general, I think it was a concerted effort to raise immigration levels. I think it's important when we're talking about macroeconomic themes and markets and capital market issues, resist the temptation to highlight and point to only one thing. It's never just one thing. And on this channel, I'll do my level best to give you context and provide a more holistic approach to these economic and macroeconomic phenomena. So I think the first thing to just highlight is that indeed it was increased targets. And we'll see in the following charts just that they increased the PR levels that Canada should accept. And that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but I don't think that that's really where it all went wrong. There was new initiatives, starting with, I've just given you a couple examples here, but there's a global skills strategy, which increased the speed at which people would be approved for immigration. There was the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Project, which was specific to the Atlantic regions in order to increase immigration there. There was obviously lobbying efforts, and related to that is the skills shortage abuses, where companies basically lied about it in order lied about their issues in order to get immigration to specific parts of the economy. And that's related to lowering standards, which, we had a very strict points-based system, again, like I said, mentioned on education or language, etc. And, by doing things like family reunification, people don't like to hear that, but that's a way of bypassing the points-based system. More recently, there's been the student visa debacle, which with all those fake private universities, a lot of them centered in Ontario, where you saw student enrollment go up by 10 times. Literally from 3,000 people overnight, the student enrollment increased to 35,000 and more. Virtually all of those students are immigrants, and they pay dearly in order to come to get these, borderline fake degrees. There's asylum fraud that's rampant. You look at a case of India, we can see that their asylum numbers have increased by 10 times. India is, as far as I'm concerned, a great country with a democratic and relatively safe. And for this to increase by 1 or 2 years, there's obviously something going on there. More recently, again, is the temporary foreign worker programs that have been focused on low wage. And we can see companies like Tim Hortons and other retailers increasing their temporary foreign workers because, according to them, they can't find people to work at Tim Hortons. I worked at a grocery store for most of my young adult life, and I can tell you there's lots of college kids happy to work those jobs. And so that's obviously a point of contention. And of course, there's the political capture. It's the unwillingness for politicians to, once presented with sort of irrefutable evidence that there's something wrong with the immigration system, to change their mind. Now, maybe that number 7 doesn't belong here anymore, because as of today, like I mentioned, they're changing the rules and they're finally walking back on some of these immigration issues. But like I said, it's never just one thing. It's a culmination of decision makers, pushing forward despite the problems that arose, and the inability sort of to adjust once evidence became clear. And so what is that evidence? So we're going to get into that over the next few slides. So what happened? And this is just a quick history lesson. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but it really sort of tells you the evolution of the immigration and population growth specifically in Canada. This chart is annual population growth from 1991 to 2003. And as you can see in the chart, it's the average annual population growth was about 320,000 per year. That's not an unreasonable number. Again, like I said, as the economy grew, this number should really increase, but nevertheless, it was relatively stable for about 25 years or so. And as you can see, in 2016, the numbers started to explode, with the exception of the COVID lockdown years. The next chart, breaking down the numbers, explains how this changed. And as you can see, for each of the different colors is related to a different type of increase or decrease in population. The blue is births minus deaths, sort of the natural attrition or natural growth of an economy's population. The second one is the red bars, and that's permanent residence. As you can see, permanent residency grew as a function of campaign promises in the 2015-2016 election cycle. There's non-permanent residents, which includes temporary foreign workers, international students, and asylum seekers. And you can see that huge explosion related to the fraud around college students, there's some dubious asylum seekers, etc. And of course, there's other, which is the yellow, and that's usually people leaving Canada, mostly for the United States, but also for Europe and Australia. The most important thing you can see from this chart is that for many, many, many years, we were basically stuck at around 300 to 400,000, and the explosion over the last 2 years to almost 3 times that running rate is really where all these problems come from. So the impact on housing and rents. And this is where we're going to shift gears to sort of what has happened and how we got there, to sort of the impact of these immigration policies. And more importantly, again, how they affect the economy and policymakers. And of course, why as investors we care. So this slide is about demand versus supply. So there's an old adage which says that the dosage makes the poison. And I think it's really important to highlight two things. Number one is that immigration is not bad. My parents are immigrants. Immigrants in general can really, really improve a society, whether they provide skills, they provide the right age demographic, they provide capital, they provide, they shake up the incumbents. There's loads of reasons why a country such as Canada that's mostly empty would want immigration. And in general, immigration is absolutely a good thing. However, the dose makes the poison. And so this chart highlights the change in demographic demand versus housing starts. And it's important to realize a couple of things. Number one, this red line has basically been flat. And what that red line is the number of housing starts. So how many units of housing are we creating every single year in Canada as an economy? And this blue line is demographic demand. Basically, the number of people coming into your country divided by the average number of people per household. And that's why you can see it's about 500. So the 1.2 million people per year divided by 2 and a bit gets you to this, 550 odd number. And as you can see, that this blue line is massively outstripping this red line. And this gap is the shortage in housing, in effect. And what's also really important is that the government was warned about this growing and unsustainable gap a couple years ago. That's where people like me get really frustrated, because this idea that we somehow didn't know what was happening with respect to immigration and housing starts and we were somehow surprised is total BS. This was an understood phenomenon many years ago, and we've seen sort of the results of this policy in 2017, 18, 19. And of course, it was sort of obscured in 2020 during COVID, but it sort of was reinvigorated, and there was a renewed life to this problem in 2023. And I think it's important that we understand that when demand outstrips supply, prices simply will rise. This is a phenomenon that's very well understood, certainly by the Bank of Canada, where I got this chart from, and what should have been understood by the government of Canada at the time. So what's another way of highlighting that demand has outstripped supply? This chart is called No Vacancy, and this highlights the decline in rental vacancy to all-time lows. This data comes from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and it shows that since 1998, which is where the data starts from, we can see that rental vacancies are virtually at all-time low. There was another time in 2001 we were almost there, but nevertheless, we are now at an all-time low. And it stands to reason. If you increase housing demand much, much faster than you increase housing supply, as we've demonstrated, what will happen is two things. One, the vacancy rates of housing and rental units will decline. That's natural. And the prices of that good or service, in this case, you can actually say that housing is good and service, but nevertheless, goes up. And another point to highlight also is that the Bank of Canada is very aware of this phenomenon, and I'll read you the quote here quickly. The increase in housing demand from newcomers is being felt across all types of housing, but the largest initial impact tends to be rental markets. And that's straightforward, right? Because when you come to a new country, any new country, it's not just Canada, people are more likely to start out as renters. And that's a really, really important thing because renters are normally on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. And so not only has this, this immigration policy been very difficult for all Canadians, it's especially difficult for people who don't make as much money, who basically aren't rich and they don't own their own homes. What we can see, again, on the next chart is that, I make the joke that correlation is causation, but this really just drives home the point that if you massively increase population growth and you don't have a subsequent change in your housing starts, and that gap of home demand versus home supply drops vacancy rates, increases prices. And now this chart highlights the price piece of that equation. I've described the prices of rent. I've been using the Canada's CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. And in this basket, one of the components of that basket is rent inflation. And as you can see, as the population growth soared with no commensurate increase in housing supply, you got an increase in rental inflation. It's relatively, I think, straightforward. Why this matters for policymakers is the contribution that rent inflation has on shelter, and shelter's component is very, very large in the overall CPI basket. And the CPI basket is crucial for monetary policy. And as you can see down here, the shelter weight in core CPI basket is about 40%. And then what I have a little bit of a history lesson is the shelter contribution to core inflation was relatively low and stable. But as rental prices soared and as the cost of housing soared, mind you, this includes mortgage interest costs, but nevertheless, as that component soared, it really had a major positive contributing factor to core inflation, which is one of the reasons why the Bank of Canada was forced to raise interest rates to combat this inflation. So what are the labor market woes related to immigration? Now, again, I highlighted and I will stress that immigration can be a very, very good thing for labor markets, especially depending on sort of substitution effects and how that labor market is constituted. However, what we've seen more recently, if your economy is not growing sufficiently to absorb these new entrants to your labor market, you're going to have some disconnects. Again, Canada was running a relatively stable and large net migration policy for the last 40 or 50 years. And as you can see, although unemployment was relatively high relative to the total, so that's what this chart is, unemployment rate for different types of demographics. You got the red is young people, the light blue is recent immigrants, and the dark blue is total. Now, young people generally have a higher unemployment rate relative to the economy. That's exactly what this gap highlights. And you can see the light blue also shows a relatively stable phenomena. And you can see generally recent immigrants to a country are less likely to be unemployed relative to the income and population. That's partly because, the skills don't necessarily always match. Often you're more likely to be a student. You're trying to match your credentials, etc. There's different reasons why you'll have frictional unemployment that's much higher, but nevertheless, it was quite stable. What we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, that gap is widening. And so as Canada's economy starts to slow for several reasons, we'll discuss that in another episode, we're seeing that even though we're having a massive increase in number of immigrants, our economy is unable to absorb those new immigrants. And how I can demonstrate that is the widening gap between regular unemployment rate and the unemployment rate of recent immigrants. Now, there's an argument that there's a problem when you have young people who also can't work, and those recent immigrants are often likely, again, with these policies of temporary foreign workers focused on low wage and low skilled jobs, which is what young people do. I did those, and that's what young people do. And you could see this disconnect happening where unemployment rates for young people and recent immigrants are rising significantly as Canada's economy remains sluggish. So why do we care? Let's finish this up. Why do we care? Number one is that the population boom has not translated to productivity growth. That's really important. Canada's dealing with a huge productivity problem. Recently, I think it was in March, that Carolyn Rogers, the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, talked about the big emergency, or Canada's emergency, with respect to productivity. And the title of her speech was "Time to Break the Glass: Fixing Canada's Productivity Problem." She highlighted overregulation, lack of competition, underinvestment, but she also spoke to labor mismatches. We can see this weakness in productivity in the following chart, which is from 1994 to 2015. GDP per capita in real terms, so that means adjusted for inflation, Canada and the US were basically moving in lockstep. And in 2015 and 16, we started to really deviate from the US. And in recent years, there's been an outright decline in productivity. It's a function of not just one thing, but it's obviously a confluence of many factors, as I've highlighted over here. But nevertheless, what we're seeing is that this massive population boom is coming at a very difficult time for Canada and is not translating to higher productivity. In fact, you could argue that because we're importing lots of low-wage people and low-skilled labor people, we're actually hurting Canada's productivity. But nevertheless, another reason why this is really important for investors is interest rate policy. And this is related to kind of a technical term to do with the neutral rate of interest. And that's a theoretical interest rate that would neither stimulate nor restrain economic activity. And the reality is when you massively increase your population growth rates without a commensurate increase in productivity growth, the net result of that is you need higher levels of interest rates to effectively be your new neutral rate of interest. And that's what the data from the Bank of Canada highlights, which I've shown here on the left. And that's also work from TD Bank, the economics department of TD Bank highlight here as well, which is, all things being equal, if you have a high level of population growth with no commensurate increase in productivity, then you need higher interest rates to balance out the economy. And so, that's it for today. We tried to cover different topics and issues with respect to immigration. I think it's really quite topical. We talked about its effect on housing, we talked about effect on prices, and we talked about its effect on interest rates and ultimately inflation. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow for more. Please share with someone that you know and love as we try to grow this channel and sort of delve into different topics each week. And please suggest any new topics for further analysis and discussion in the comments. And we'll see you next time.